Welcome back, everyone, as we pick up at the end of the Napoleon in Egypt series by Extra Credits, Extra History. They did kind of an addendum to it that is definitely fully connected, but is kind of a standalone story. It's called A Race to Ancient Secrets, and it has to do with the deciphering of hieroglyphics, which opened up an entire branch of history that previously had been very much locked with the ability to fully decipher hieroglyphics. Had the chance recently, just a few months ago, to visit the British Museum, where I got to see a lot of that stuff, including the Rosetta Stone. I do have a full video that'll be coming out on this channel from my visit to the British Museum, but that'll be a while yet. In the meantime, you can check out on VTH Extra the second episode of kind of my behind the scenes, showing my day-to-day stuff other than my full videos related to history. That's up live. I'll put a link down in the description. You can see the first two episodes of my trip back in January to the UK that included the British Museum. But in the meantime, the link is also there for the original content. Definitely go over and check out what Extra History has to offer, including the original content for this one. Let's take a look.
Alexandria, Egypt, 196 BCE. An artisan taps an inscription onto the stele with his chisel, doing a great service for his pharaoh. You see, his king, Ptolemy V, really needs something to court the priests. For the Ptolemaic dynasty are not Egyptians at all. They're actually Greeks. And for generations, these foreign kings have kept power over Egypt by engaging with the priests of its traditional religion.
So they're not only Greek, which is why all the hubbub about the Cleopatra series on Netflix, because the Ptolemies were Greek. They were Mediterranean. They weren't sub-Saharan African. But they also were very heavily inbred. And let me show you what I'm talking about. So just for an example here, this is Cleopatra VII, which is the famous Cleopatra that everybody talks about. Her father was Ptolemy XII, who had Cleopatra with her mother, Cleopatra V, who also happened to be Ptolemy XII's niece. But it doesn't end there. You go back to his father, Ptolemy IX, and you can see that you have Ptolemy X here, who married Bernice, who had Cleopatra V, and there's Ptolemy XI, who was with Bernice III over here. And basically, what you end up seeing is that you only have just a handful of people. It's really a family poll, and you can't even really easily decipher it by looking at this, because every generation you go back, they are inbreeding with people that they're already related to. And so as that goes down more and more, there's just further inbreeding taking place. So your father's father's father was also related to you three different other ways, as an uncle and a cousin, and things like that. So it's an absolute mess, but it was what they did.
This inscription is the Memphis Decree, exempting the priestly class from taxes and from coming to pay homage to him, a gesture the teenage king hopes will steady his throne and prevent another uprising.
So what's really cool about this is that this major archaeological discovery was a pretty standard run-of-the-mill kind of announcement that was made, right? But there's so many of these that have been found. They call them steles, or stele sometime. It depends on how you pronounce it, Stele. And they're these decrees that are found all over the place. And a perfect example of this is that not too long ago, the Israeli king Omri, Omri, was thought to be not really sure if he really existed. He was mentioned in the Bible, but not really anywhere else. And then they found this decree from a Moabite king that mentions Omri, the king of Israel. And so these kinds of things are happening all the time. And so what's amazing is that events that happened 3,000 years ago are still being better understood because of discoveries that continue to be made. Our understanding of history, it's not like the historical events from 3,000 years ago are set in stone and there's nothing new to learn. We are learning new things all the time. It's amazing.
And the artisan describes the decree in 3 languages: Greek, the language of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egyptian hieroglyphics for the priests, and Demotic for the common people. But he has no idea that part of this stele, broken and swept away by flood, will one day unlock the language of ancient Egypt. Big shout out to Factor for helping me decode what's for dinner. July 15th, 1799. Fort Julian, outside Rashid, Egypt. Nearly 2,000 years later, French military engineer Pierre-François Bouchard is repairing the defenses of an Arab fort, strengthening it against the Ottoman fleet that's expected to arrive within days. A year ago, the French army had invaded Egypt and attempted to set up a colony, but that increasingly looked doomed to failure. Both the Ottomans and British are mustering to attack the French, and the army has to consistently battle internal revolts. During the repair work, they find the stone, seemingly used as scrap construction material in an old wall. The engine
used as scrap construction material in an old wall, completely discarded because really it had no historical value to the people who were building that wall. And this random discovery while they're preparing fortifications for around 1800 battle is when they find this stuff. And this happens all the time where people are putting in sewer pipes and they find just priceless discoveries. It's crazy.
Engineers immediately bring it to Bouchard's attention, as they're supposed to do with any artifact. Because you see, alongside the military campaign, which you can learn about in our Napoleon in Egypt series here, the French expedition also had an academic component. Over 150 so-called savants. Scientists, writers, linguists, and other academics have come along, setting up a research institute in Cairo where they study everything from local wildlife to ancient artifacts. Seeing the script on the broken stone, Bouchard immediately realizes the implications of this find. If this is the same inscription in 3 different languages, it could be the key to finally deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics.
And this is so key too, right? Because what if it had been somebody else who found it and didn't say anything to anybody, or just didn't think it mattered, it wasn't a big deal, it wasn't important, and he just put it back where he found it, or buried it, or did something with it. I wonder how many times in history that's happened where things that could have unlocked our understanding or completely changed our view of some historic event have been discarded or ignored.
So, he sends out a message saying he's found a curious artifact near Rosetta, the French name for Rashid. He then passed the stone to General Monod, transferring it to his tent to be cleaned and the Greek to be translated, while they dug in hopes of finding its missing pieces. But then, as the French army fought off an Ottoman landing at Abu Qir Bay, Bouchard accompanied the 1,700-pound stone to the savants' headquarters, the Egyptian Institute. And it arrived just in time for Napoleon to see it before he ditched the expedition and sailed back to France. In doing so, he left the savants with a deteriorating military situation, alongside a priceless but extremely heavy artifact that they had no way of getting back to France. Yet the information...
And it's a pretty good size. If you go to the British Museum in London and see it, it's probably, maybe 2.5, 3 feet wide and probably 6 or 7 feet tall.
Must be spread, especially once they determined the mysterious third language was not Syriac as originally thought, but the Demotic mentioned in classical sources. At first, they tried copying it by hand, but it proved too intricate. They were stuck until a brainstorm. Instead of copying it, why don't they just smear ink on the front and then press it with paper like it was a printing press? It worked. And while the French army hauled the stone around, even to battlefields, unwilling to leave it unguarded, prints of the inscription had already reached Paris. Which was good, because the Rosetta Stone wouldn't. In 1801, General Monod, now in charge of the expedition, signed a surrender agreement with the British and the Ottomans. And one of the provisions was that all of the artifacts retrieved during the French expedition to Egypt were now spoils of war and the personal property of King George III.
And there you go. That's why it ended up in the British Museum. But yeah, and there was some work already going on. Attempts to try and decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics, and they had gotten a few things here and there. It wasn't like it was completely foreign, right? People had been working on this stuff for a while, but this certainly vastly sped up the process.
Especially the Rosetta Stone. In fact, the British were so pleased with its acquisition that they actually painted on the side, "Captured in Egypt by the British Army in 1801. A year later, when King George donated it to the British Museum, he added on the other side, "Presented by King George III." Now, I bet you think you know how this goes from here. They matched the Greek with the hieroglyphics and boom, ancient Egyptian deciphered, right? Well, turns out, not actually. Even matching the hieroglyphic characters with the Greek, no one could make heads or tails out of them. But that also wasn't really their fault.
And it's also important to understand that the Greek of 2,000, 3,000 years ago is not the Greek of today, right? It was something called Koine Greek. Much of the New Testament, in fact, I think pretty much all of the New Testament was written in Koine Greek. There's some Aramaic in there, I think, too. But it's a different language. It's just like English from 800 years ago bears not a lot of resemblance to English of today. So that complicates things too.
See, the Europeans were missing a key piece of the puzzle, and had been for 2,000 years. Europeans had been trying to figure out how to read hieroglyphics for centuries, but the only instructions on how to do so came from ancient Greek and Roman writers who insisted that they were ideographic, using pictures to indicate concepts. And while that was true sometimes, they could also be phonetic, indicating sounds the same way alphabetic languages do. And that misunderstanding was inherited all the way to the 1800s. Medieval Muslim researchers tried to crack the code and failed, though two did discover that some lined up with Coptic, a descendant of ancient Egyptian. Then later, when Renaissance alchemists attempted to read the texts, hoping to learn ancient spells, healing practices, and other wonders, they had even less luck. And it wasn't until 1814 that an English polymath named Thomas Young made the first real progress. Young, a medical doctor, scientist, and linguist, at first just busied himself with translating the Demotic section of the Rosetta Stone.
So I want to stop and point out something really important here that they mention, which is that a lot of what set them back was that they started with a false premise, right? So when they believed that these were symbols rather than that some of them actually represented sounds, everything they did after that was faulty, right? So it's like a branch off where everything down this road is wrong. You have to go all the way back to the beginning of the road and start over again. So we do that sometimes with history, and we do that sometimes in our lives when we start with a faulty premise and then build everything on that. Even though everything we might be building is decent, we started with the wrong foundation, and so it's all going to be off.
However, after a conversation with another researcher who suggested that the Ptolemies, being Greek, might have written their names phonetically in hieroglyphics, he decided to jump sections. Finding the royal name should be easy enough, he reasoned, since it had been suggested that they were always in a circle that we now know as a cartouche.
Yeah, so anytime you see that symbol like that, you're typically looking at a name for royalty, a lot of times pharaohs.
Sure enough, he found the name Ptolemies. Upon further study, Young found 80 similarities between the hieroglyphic section of the stone and the Demotic one. But that is where his work stalled, as he incorrectly assumed that hieroglyphics were logographic, that each symbol represented a word, like Chinese or Japanese, and that only the Greek names would have phonetic equivalents. Still, that discovery made Young's name, and soon researchers all across Europe were writing to him, including a French prodigy named Jean-François Champollion, who, quite annoyingly, kept asking for better quality prints of the stone's inscriptions. But to be clear, he wasn't just some irritating student. Champollion was a far more talented linguist than Young, and crucially, he spoke Coptic. Actually, he'd been working on and off on his own attempt to translate hieroglyphics, believing that they were, in fact, phonetic. However, being in France, he had to work off print copies of the stone, and he likely never even saw it in person. But he didn't just use the Rosetta Stone prints, for there were more drawings of hieroglyphic inscriptions and artifacts coming out of Egypt every year.
See, that's what's really exciting about this, right? Is that once you think you've got it unlocked, now start trying it out, right? Start looking at some of the columns that you have, and start looking at some of the other artifacts that have been brought back, and the stuff's coming back constantly. It's a chance to try it out. See if it makes sense. See if your translation works, and if you're able to uncover things. And now you're on to something.
Example, in 1815, wealthy Englishman William John Banks was touring Egypt when he fell in love with a 22-foot-tall, 6-ton obelisk and decided, man, that would just really look great in my front yard. It also had inscriptions in hieroglyphics and Greek, so he hoped it would be a second Rosetta Stone. So he did what anyone would do. Hired an Italian circus strongman to coordinate hauling it back to his estate in Dorset. The rich, man, they're just like us. Meanwhile, Champollion had been hammering away, using his earlier work on Demotic and knowledge of Coptic to reconstruct theoretical cartouches of common Egyptian royal names. His hope was that these cartouches, should he find them in inscriptions, would gradually unlock more hieroglyphic characters. This he did while also feuding with rivals and periodically going into exile for his continued support of Napoleon. Then, when Banks sent him a print of the inscriptions on his obelisk, Champollion stopped dead. There, on the side, was his reconstruction of Cleopatra.
Boom. And here, now you got people working together, right? Nobody has all the answers. And so take this guy's knowledge and this guy's knowledge and then put it together, and now you unlock even more. You love to see that.
He went into a feverish blitz of work and began to realize that Egyptian hieroglyphics were a mix of ideographic and phonetic characters. And it was 1822 when it all clicked.
Wow.
He read the name Thutmose from an imported inscription, then checked it against the Rosetta Stone. He then bolted from his desk, ran down the street to his brother's house, and supposedly screamed, "I've got it!"
And there's actually, I want to show you something, because there's actually like a whole like docudrama series on this that's really, really cool. So this is the one that I saw. It's called The Secrets of the Hieroglyphs. And it's about linguist Champollion fulfills his dream by visiting Egypt to read the inscriptions on temple walls. And so you can see it's got some of these characters that we're talking about here. It was really very cool. And I learned a lot about this whole process and how it all went down.
Collapsing in a dramatic faint. Young and Champollion would war over credit for the rest of their lives, with Young claiming that Champollion did not acknowledge his work, while Champollion said that the methodical Young had merely recognized similar characters without reading them. Both.
So here's what's important about this. This is not unlike so many other things, right? Nobody discovers this stuff in a vacuum. Everybody's building on the work of people who came before them or even contemporaries, right? The Wright brothers did not just invent the plane from scratch while nobody else was working on it, right? There were other people working on the same stuff. And the Wright brothers built on other people's research, and other people built on their research, and all those sorts of things. The space program is a direct result of rocket programs during World War II. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb. He perfected research that had already been done by other people. All that kind of stuff.
Both went on to withhold research from the other, and in the polarized environment of post-Napoleonic Europe, who a researcher supported was heavily influenced by patriotism. But Champollion's system, despite what some English academics claimed, worked. And in 1829, he fulfilled his lifelong dream of traveling to Egypt. Once there, he found a vanished world begin to speak to him.
Could you even imagine stuff we take for granted today that wasn't known 200 years ago? Going to Egypt, and this stuff is everywhere there. I was talking about it the other day. I really hope I can go to Egypt someday and see this stuff firsthand. My goodness, the history that is there. And to just be able to read stuff that had been gibberish a generation earlier.
His developing dictionary and grammar system, he read the words of gods and priests off temple walls. He uncovered kings whose names had not been spoken in a millennia, and in the papyrus scrolls preserved in the arid deserts of Upper Egypt, he found the words of the common people. Even though he'd never laid eyes on it, the Rosetta Stone had unlocked Egypt. And while I would never suggest that my discovering the secret of something like, say, great meals ready super fast was ever on par with the Rosetta Stone, I also can't eat the Rosetta Stone, which is why I gotta tell.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up right there. There's so much more. Obviously, this is just kind of an overview of the story. It's definitely worth a deep dive, but it's so cool. It's so cool that this is one of those moments in history that 200 years ago, our understanding of history was so different because it hadn't happened yet. So pretty cool stuff. Check out my visit to, or at least a little bit of my visit to the British Museum. I'm going to be doing a full video showing a lot of what I saw there down the road that'll be on this channel, but the link's in the description for that. And also, there's now a vote up on Patreon and for our members here on YouTube as well about what our next reaction series will be. So if you're a patron, a member, or you want to become one, go ahead and vote today, and we'll start that new series tomorrow. Thanks for watching.